This is Tim Bryce with my column titled, Trying to Kick Trump Under the Bus. What we are witnessing as we transition from one presidential administration to another is political theater at its worst, including a second impeachment of President Trump and an overt offensive against Trump supporters. While the Democrats try to disgrace President Trump by kicking him under the bus, the reality is they are not kidding anyone but themselves. While these shenanigans go on, the country has stalled and the affairs of the nation are not being addressed, except by President Trump in his final days. That is a fact. In terms of the president's second impeachment, this is getting little notice by the American public as they know this is nothing but a political charade, even among grassroots Democrats. Many are asking why they are even bothering with this as his term is rapidly coming to an end. Let me see if I can explain. Following the Stop the Steal protests of January 6, where some people broke into Congress under suspicious circumstances, perhaps because they were not Trump supporters at all, Speaker Nancy Pelosi used this as an excuse to bring impeachment charges against President Trump for the second time, allegedly for inciting insurrection. Normally, this would go to the Judiciary Committee first for discussion and vote before coming to the floor of the House. But not this time, as it is being rushed at the 11th hour. Prior to the protest, the president addressed his supporters. There's nothing in his speech to suggest he incited anything. There were only 3 comments that apply here. He said, quote, "We soon will be marching over to the Capitol to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard," end quote. Second one, quote, "Today you will be marching to the Capitol to cheer on those brave senators and congressmen and women to do the right thing," end quote. And the third and final one is, quote, "We are going to the Capitol to give our Republicans the kind of pride and boldness they need to take our country back," end quote. Other than that, the speech mostly detailed a long list of his administration's accomplishments and then detailed the many examples of election fraud in the large cities of the battleground states, followed by his proposals for election reform. In other words, the speech was perfectly acceptable. It is hard to imagine how the Congress will try to misrepresent his words. Nonetheless, the Democrats and news media have blown this out of proportion intentionally as they see it as a way to seek revenge against a president they couldn't control or manipulate. All of this is nothing more than a way to get back at someone who wouldn't kowtow to the Washington establishment, also known as the swamp. Congress may claim outrage over the incident, but the reality is they are jealous President Trump retains a loyal following and are still afraid of him. As such, the impeachment has 2 objectives. First, to kick the president under the bus in the hope he doesn't run for a second term. And second, to take note of the GOP senators and House members who voted against impeachment and use this as a mark of disgrace in the next election. Whereas President Trump wanted to run the office of the president like a business, the Washington culture is one of scratching each other's backs for financial gain, an incestuous relationship between politicians, lobbyists, and journalists. Even Republicans on Capitol Hill showed their true colors by backpedaling on their support for the president. This has not gone unnoticed by grassroots Republicans who are mortified by the weakness of the GOP. So much so, the Republican Party is now in a damage control mode of operation. To illustrate, here in my home county in Florida, hundreds of people have already changed their party affiliation from Republican to Independent, with many more likely to occur. This is how disgusted people are with their spineless Republican politicians. Had the November elections happened now, Republican politicians would likely find themselves out on the street. That is how serious it has become, while people gravitate to new political groups. The Democrats on Capitol Hill would have us believe Trump supporters no longer support the rule of law and as such must be suppressed for the safety of the country. The reality is, there are no stronger advocates of law and order than Trump supporters. This, too, is a fact. Yet the Democrats are painting a picture of their threat to society. Forget about the Democrat-backed support of Antifa and Black Lives Matter, who burned and killed people and businesses this past summer of hate. Democrats, this is a perfectly acceptable form of conduct. They think they can immobilize the Trump people by doing such things as introducing legislation to prohibit Trump rallies and clamp down on their ability to communicate. The congressional break-in became a convenient excuse by social media companies to censor opponents of Democrats, specifically conservative groups and individuals who suddenly disappeared from their platforms like a mafia hit. Even Parler, a free speech social network, was given the heave-ho by Amazon. Twitter permanently suspended President Trump's account, and a horde of his supporters terminated their membership, including yours truly. This suppression of free speech by social media is scary as, inevitably, talk radio will be next, and conservatives will be without an effective channel of communications. So much for the First Amendment. This brings up a point. The cancel culture of this country is reaching new levels. I admit to tuning out the major television networks and cable news outlets as they have lost credibility with me. I simply do not trust them and see them as instruments of the far left. Nor will I watch movies by such actors as Robert De Niro, Tom Hanks, or George Clooney. They have politicized themselves to the point I cannot bring myself to watch them or pay to see their movies. And yes, I have canceled newspapers I believe spout nothing but fake news. The point is, the growing cancel culture is producing two Americas with allegiances that are diametrically opposed to each other and heightening tensions. This cannot possibly end well. Yes, the call for impeachment is being done more for political histrionics than anything else. It is also very duplicitous. So much so, it makes me wonder who is really calling the shots for the Democrats. After all, Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer are not smart enough to engineer such a scenario. They are just following orders. Even Joe Biden called the Stop the Steal protesters as domestic terrorists, to wit, quote, "They were a riotous mob, insurrectionists, domestic terrorists. It's that basic," end quote. Come on, Joe. Take your medicine and sit in the corner. Why didn't you use this language when Antifa and Black Lives Matter ran amok this past summer? President-elect unity. What a hypocrite. As Pelosi pushes this forward, I hope the president has her arrested and charged with treason for trying to get the Joint Chiefs to change Trump's nuclear codes. This is an overt attempt to disrupt the chain of command in order to overthrow the government. Nobody believes the January 6th Stop the Steal protest was a legitimate act of insurrection, but they are blowing it out of proportion to run President Trump and his supporters out of town so they can resume their incestuous love affair. Unfortunately, it will not work. Trump supporters will simply regroup and take back the Capitol by use of the ballot box. This may or may not include Republicans. Actually, we are long overdue for a cleanup of the nation's capital altogether. Now is the time for election reform to eliminate these career politicians. Since the Congress will not do it, it's time for a constitutional convention. One last note about the Democrats impeaching President Trump for a second time. They can impeach him as many times as they want, but historians will record this as nothing but political retribution. As much as the Democrats want to portray it as a badge of shame, it is backfiring on them and now being viewed as a badge of honor he received for standing up to the establishment. It will also diminish the concept of impeachment, which will hurt them in the next congressional election, which is now less than 2 years away. Now, the next question will be, will the Republicans have the nerve to impeach Joe Biden? Friends, keep the faith. This is Tim Bryce in Palm Harbor, Florida. Follow me on the internet